Thanks everyone for joining today's webinar where we're going to be discussing, are you aligning your intelligent automation program with your business objectives? I'm really excited to be hosting with Agilify for the first time, Forrester and Leslie Joseph. So thanks for being on, and also a colleague of mine, Peter Tarrant, who is the product architect. So as we kind of get started off, I know we've got a rich content that we want to get to. So just really quick, we'll just go around and introduce ourselves. I'm Scott Teeple, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Agilify, and have been really in this RPA space since the beginning. So really excited to bring some of the expertise in starting out Center of Excellence and working through helping others also their automation program. So Leslie, if you take a moment to introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Hi, guys. I'm Leslie Joseph. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester. I cover AI and automation. I started the RPA services coverage at Forrester sometime last year, and I continue to advise customers on essentially how to build and scale and drive value from various aspects of their automation program as they move ahead.
Very good. Yeah, and thank you for joining. I'm very excited to have you on. And Peter, you take a moment to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Peter, and I started out in the automation journey with Agilify's primary client as a technically minded business me that was building automations, and moved to operations and then more to analytics, and now into more product management for Agilify as I move deeper into the Agilify business. So moved over probably about 4 years ago. Fully into the Agilify business, and been moving around and done a lot of things within the business since then. So really excited to be here as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for coming. So as we really kind of set the stage for the conversation today, you know, the early days of RPA, as most of us on the phone have been involved in, was really around the low-hanging fruits. It's finding those opportunities to really bring value to your automation. So you had this low investment that gave the opportunities, and we had to find automations that were going to give you that value really quick. So the overall focus was finding those automations that could bring that value really fast. The next really focus was around building your pipeline and making sure that you had enough to sustain the overall program, and how you were really going to have a full, rich opportunity for future investments. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those automations that you were putting in place were aligned with your business objectives. And what we find as we really are starting to mature the overall programs through your COE is that we not necessarily focused on just those automations that are impacting the overall business as a whole. And I know, Leslie, there was quite a few reports over the last couple of years that really focus and really pinpoint on this topic, which is why we're excited to have you on the webinar today. But one of those was the Forrester report, Refocus Process Automation to Rescue Your Digital Transformation and Mastering the Post-BPM World of Digital Automation, which was a really great article. So if you get an opportunity to read through that, we definitely highly suggest that. But in there was a graph that talked about the alignment with business strategy and it being the most important driver for process improvement. There was also another article that you specifically wrote that was Robotic Process Automation Services in the Q4 2019 report, where you talked about RPA service buyers are the best served by vendors that take a broader strategic view of the automation portfolio. And I think these really are great examples of how it's so important that we're not just getting the automation programs off the ground, but we're really getting that focus to what is the overall business objectives and saying, hey, how do we align that strategy? So from your perspective, if you could please just go into how, buyers and what they should be looking for in the perspective that they should be in.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. So I think it's a very interesting juncture that we are at in terms of the evolution of automation, because for the longest of time, automation was really a back office, cost-centered, imperative that companies followed for very specific, more tactical reasons. And what's happening now over the last few years is that as automation tools become more and more available in people's hands, and as some of the tools become more user-friendly and penetrate within the organization, people are starting to realize that it's not really about doing a few of those big bang automations with really complex processes, but it's also about taking them a little lower down into the organization and focusing on the small, long tail of processes that exist pretty much across the organization in any function, finance, retail processes, supply chain, the small little processes that can be automated in a much more constant and predictable way across the board. Now, what is also interestingly happening is that while this is true, there is also a shift happening in the buyer, right? So I would say phase one of the automation, the RPA market has been characterized by a lot of these companies that were typically big banks or very large shared services organizations of multinational companies. And their focus was really on, hey, there's this new cool technology, this robotic process automation or other forms of automation. What can we do with it? But then, the market has evolved in its understanding of how to use these tools effectively. And these first movers, phase one companies, as I call them, they were also willing to go through the pain of figuring things out as they went along, right? And so, yes, some of them did really well. Some of them kind of learned the ropes as, they made up the rules as they went. Mm-hmm. What's been happening over maybe the last year or year and a half is that more and more people have started to come and look at automation at RPA and say, hey, wait a minute, there's something there that I could use. But this phase two, the new kinds of companies that are coming here, they're typically not necessarily the very large banks, the very large retailers. They're the second tier. They're coming in from geographies like LATAM or from Australia. They're coming in from the mid market or the $1 billion to $10 billion size revenue size companies. And for them, they don't have the time, the money, or the inclination to actually sit and go through the process of learning by trial and error. They want things to work. They want to come in and have processes pre-built. They want applications. They want business cases that are snap in. So that's one of the things that I highlighted in my report is that if you think about the buyer today, what the market is really demanding are three things. The first is they demand a meta framework for the automation program. As you mentioned, Scott, it's not just enough to have somebody come in and set up the first few automations. It's also important for them to come in and bring in some of the meta framework, like how do you govern these automations? How do you manage them in a sustainable, scalable sort of way? So that's the first. The second is, does the provider or do the vendors who bring in this expertise, do they actually understand what it takes to create scale? And that's a very interesting conversation to have, because today, as I pointed out in my own research, that 50%, 52% of companies are below 10 bots. 75% of companies are below 50 bots. And I know, the number of bots is a fuzzy kind of way to calculate it, but it's a good proxy metric. And that problem of scale, of sustainable scale, still remains. And at the same time, you have all of these new things coming in, intelligent automation and AI and various capabilities that come into the RPA matrix. And so the broader ecosystem, and now you have process mining and digital worker analytics that are coming up on the horizon, which allow for companies to take a more systematic way to approach processes and identifying opportunities for automation. And so in that context, it's really also important to look at this ecosystem and be a part of it, be embedded in it so that you can provide greater value. Like I said, it's all about sustainable scale.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely about sustainable scale. And Peter, as we really look at kind of, we talked through that beginning pieces, but we're really widening the aperture. Take us through, looking beyond just the easy task to the greater process.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of process improvement that was highlighted in that first report that you mentioned, understanding an end-to-end business process, and what Leslie said about the long tail of smaller tasks that impact it. You can automate the front end of a bulk task of a business process where there's a lot of transactions, but you automate all of that, but you still have people at the other end that are doing work. So all you've done really accomplished in automation is increase their pipeline, right? You haven't actually increased your throughput of the whole business process. So being able to not just point to individual tasks where you save, but looking at an end-to-end process and filling your pipeline that way, as opposed to just having, like Leslie said, these high volume tasks all over the place where you might not actually be getting your objectives that you want. A program manager or a director of a finance department may want something along the lines of decrease, perhaps for AP within finance, decrease cost per invoice, right? Your organizational cost per invoice. And an automation that just does a ton of transactions might not actually do that, right? Because there's so much more than just keying or digitizing invoices to actually decrease or change your cost per invoice along the line, change your business throughput. So really trying to fill your pipeline, automation pipeline, focused on an end-to-end process, and Leslie says, really taking care of that long tail to really increase your throughput by your business. That's kind of the widening the aperture to look beyond just that high volume task at the start of the process, or maybe even in the middle of the process, but really looking at that full length. And
I think
that's there.
Yeah, I think to that point, right? And then what we find is that when we're really focused on just the value of just those individuals, those don't actually add up, significantly over time, because we're not really tying them back to what a CFO really wants, right? Isn't just these individual automations that provide that value, but collectively across the entire, budget sheet, right? Across your P&L, how is those automations really changing the game to really bring that overall value? I think it's really critical, and having that narrow-minded view of each of those automations doesn't necessarily provide that overall value. So, and understanding. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say that strategic mindset that Leslie mentioned. A lot of these smaller automation COEs are single department, right? Or maybe even single function, where somebody was told to pilot something. So we get this extremely federated model where individual departments are really just after their own interests, and they're not looking downstream necessarily. They're really just automating that one task that's a problem for them, not necessarily prioritizing based on the wider organization. So having that more strategic manager, whether it's an internal program manager or somebody that you hire to do it, is really key in actually achieving that, to take the businesses out of just the automation program, out of just that one function, right? That usually it started in, and they feel some ownership of, and really still enabling them, but having a wider organizational picture.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because it's not very uncommon for us in our conversations with customers to come across these situations where essentially the organization has gone ahead, and because the entry barrier to something like RPA is so low, anybody can go create an automation, right? So there's this anecdotal story of this iconic hotel in Singapore where this guy sitting in the basement, he basically automated his entire job and told, with a free tool, and told nobody about it for 3 months. And then they caught on, and then they made him the head of automation. But the fact is that, it becomes, it's very common for us to see organizations where we end up with all these individual islands of automation with completely different standards and completely different ways of approaching things and of coding. And then when all of this rolls up at the doorstep of the CIO or whoever's kind of leading the automation effort across, it becomes this huge, activity, this work stream to kind of integrate all of this and bring it together and make sense across the organization. So very true. I completely agree with what you said.
Yeah, just not within the IT world, but also within the CFO and the finance world. And then you've got the operations side of it. And then you're saying, okay, how am I actually gaining alignment across the entire executive team to say, hey, the true value of what this thing can bring is much bigger than just that individual piece or that one person sitting in his basement automating, right? And I think, the conversations around our current situation and COVID-19 is really bringing, I think, a lot of light to some of the situations that's happening to say, the real business drivers is our focus today, right? And there's a lot of opportunities that exist that are nice to have, but everybody's really hunkering it down and focusing on those things that are really going to make the most impact to the business to say, hey, how do I sustain this? And those are where, a lot of the key areas are. But how do we enter into, this shift from, hey, the art of the possible is all over the place, and we've got intelligent automation, we've got all this stuff going on, but the real value here is getting to the business impact. And how do I avoid? I know that in 2018 we co-authored a report for the global intelligent automation market. H2 2018 was the title, where we laid out 13 stall points. And I think that a lot of these are really hitting true as we really walk through this. So if you hadn't had an opportunity to read that, I highly suggest that you download that from the SSON website. But in that article, we really talked through a couple of key things that we're talking about here right now, which is effective execution, and really around some of the ideas to say, hey, it's great that you have developers sitting there doing the work, but really when it comes to execution, who's going to do that? How are you going to actually get things into production? How are you going to ensure that you have a digital workforce that's going to keep those things running? We laugh quite a bit about robots don't get sick, right? We know that given the situation that we're in right now. But there's got to be somebody who's going to be there to ensure that systems are still up and that they're still working. We've got connectivity issues now today. We've got underestimating the true benefits of automation, which is exactly what we were just talking about before. If we're only looking at it from a department perspective, we're not really truly looking at the broader scale of that. And then lacking automation strategy. Again, you guys just talked about that. You know, it's like, it's great that you have this idea and we'll just put it into a department and you'll just try it out. But man, if we're not really taking a look and saying, do we have somebody in the organization that has the title automation something, right? Whether that's digital transformation or automation strategy or something, you know, they're not really going to have that needed focus, or even neglecting process change management. I think, Peter, your point earlier was, it's great that you can automate here, but what about upstream and downstream, and how those are really impacting, I think, the broader scope of how we're really getting into it. So Leslie, through your expertise, and you know, we had some side conversations early on, just really around process automation is critical to customer experience and digital transformation. Could you take a moment just to talk through kind of your experience and what you're seeing on this? Absolutely.
So, like I said, you know, before, it's an interesting transition that we're making in terms of mindset and approach to automation. The first wave was really all about, you know, the back office, finance and operations, procurement. But what I'm starting to see is that a handful of companies are starting to look at automation a little differently and bring it a little more closer to their core business model, right? So I make this distinction between transactional and transformational automation. So transactional automation was pretty much everything that we've seen in the last 4 years around, procurement processes or, purchase and things like that, where the focus was really mostly on cost containment. It was really on cost takeout and on margins. But then now what we're starting to see, especially with some of the intelligent automation capabilities come in that allow for companies to use and actually to inject AI and machine learning into RPA and kind of into embed intelligence into the bots, companies are starting to realize that there is an opportunity for a much more deeper and strategic application of RPA in the context of their business. And this is really important because I know that there's a lot of vendor noise out there that tries to conflate AI and machine learning with RPA. That's probably, that isn't true. But what RPA is, and this is a very important point, right, is that it's kind of a socketing mechanism for you to embed intelligence within a process. And that makes all the difference, because now the footprint that you have to operate inside the enterprise, it changes quite radically from primarily routine, mundane back office processes, stepwise processes, to a certain kind of process which involve decision making and which involve a certain amount of fuzziness to the way that decisions are made and the process is transacted, and that allows for companies to start doing interesting things. Like, for example, there are companies in publishing or in companies that do financial reports and ratings of securities and other instruments, which actually are starting to use bots to go out into the web and do the ingest and the extract parts of their data collection independent of humans, using intelligent bots that are a combination of RPA and AI. And that, to me, is the first level of transformation. But these same companies are kind of now starting to say, now that we have that on, can we use NLP or can we use certain kinds of AI models, machine learning models, to actually start creating reports and to relook at our business model, where we move away from creating these set fixed format reports to actually injecting information into our customers' work streams at the moment when they need it the most. again, using a combination of bots and machine intelligence. So it's a very different world that's emerging. And I won't say that every company is there. In fact, we are just at the starting point of this revolution. But if we kind of draw the trajectory of this outwards to 2 or 3 years, we'll start to see a lot more of transformational automation creep into core business processes and become kind of part of the way companies view their business in the first place.
No, I absolutely love that, and I know that Peter and I, have had lots of conversations about what we call applied ML or applied AI, or right. It's like it's great to have these science projects, right? To say, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could take this data and magically create some value out of it? And then after a couple of months of going, you start looking, saying, well, we don't really have the data, or we don't really understand what that is. And I think what you're saying is that when you start with a real business problem, when you start looking at kind of the business problem, right? And that's what we're kind of talking about here, is the business impact and how is it going to impact the bottom line. We start then really looking at a real use case and saying, hey, is there opportunities to bring intelligence into it? Can we bring NLP into it? Can we kind of bring some of this new technology and then start solving it from the bottom up? And I think that some of the confusions that we're hearing and what we're seeing, again, I'd love to joke about all the different words that we're hearing in the marketplace today, right? Is it automation singularity? Is it automation platform? Is it integrated automation? Is it intelligent automation? Is it triple, right? Whatever these things are, right? There's so much confusion that's getting ingested into the marketplace. And it's like at the core, what really, really matters here is the business impact itself, right? How is what we're doing and the overall strategy of what we're doing impacting the business as we see? So
and I think the starting point really comes from that process, right? If you understand your process and you build your RPA, and then you know where those opportunities are to go to that next step, right? Because if you look at it, and it's the idea of if you start there, you can plan ahead, right? You can look ahead to see what's coming. You can see what the best practices are with some vendors or some other places that are more apt to transformation early, the early adopters, and identify, instead of having a myriad of data science experiments that may or may not have value, you've already identified a place in your business process or an opportunity to say, this is where we can inject this and move right into something that is applied, right? The confusion around AI and this magical word is AI is anything you want it to be until it actually becomes something, right? Like OCR or NLP or classification, right? We have these words now, these services that Google or Azure or Amazon have. All of those would have been AI a couple of years ago, except now they have a business problem and they apply it, right? So that application is very, very important, and that's when you start actually getting to, and most of it is really just machine learning, and advanced forms of it, and better architectures and better algorithms and so on and so forth, all that technical stuff, right? But you get down to it, and it's you now have many, many more opportunities where the business problem has a specific solution to it. You don't need to build it yourself. Somebody already has, right? So it's no longer this mystical AI. It's applied. It's something that's there, and some companies have even commoditized it, right? It's a usage ticker that you use with Google or whatever it may be. So understanding your problem and what's even out there lets you just jump right to that application, which is really important in planning and looking ahead and looking at the market and seeing what's out there, instead of buying the hype of AI and this general intelligence that's still many, many years away. Really understanding your business problem and what's been done to actually solve that particular one by a myriad of places out there. So I think, that's really, really important.
Have you heard the one about the difference between AI and machine learning? If it's
I've heard many flavors of that, yeah.
If it's written in Python, it's machine learning. If it's written in PowerPoint, it's AI.
That's right. I hadn't heard that one, actually. That's great.
I love that one. That's so great. So Peter, why don't you maybe transition now us into another topic that, I think it loops right into, as you start talking about more cost savings than just ROI, and this idea around total automation program yield, and that, it's great that you can have automations being put in production. Now we're transitioning into the overall business impact, but we may be actually leaving some value on the table and not getting credit for all the places that you're focused on.
Yeah, I think one of the easy sell points of RPA was the easy way to measure hours saved, right? You're taking FTE hours out of a task and either reapplying those FTE hours as is more popular now, or in the early days, it was just cutting a bunch of FTEs. But now the more the value of now you have FTE hours freed up to do more cognitive tasks, and reassigning or reskilling and things along those lines. It was really easy and low-hanging fruit, and especially in that federated model where people were so focused on the department, that's really what it was. But as you get into larger business impact, you were neglecting to find the dollars and hours saved in downstream processes. Take for example, in a case study that we recently did, where we were looking at, again, invoice and PO, kind of supply chain work, procurement work. And if you increase the quality of your purchase orders and the data within your purchase orders, you're impacting your finance department because they have less things to correct. So what you probably did in your procurement team, which is usually on a different tower, different department, is you measure the hours saved there, and you're completely neglecting what's saved downstream, right? And even though those are hard dollars, right? The idea that nothing other than the task hours saved are hard. Everything else is this kind of fuzzy, undefinable, pie in the sky metric. But there are actually hard dollar metrics further down the line that you can find. And ultimately, when you get up into the organizational things, when you talk about invoice, a cost per invoice, you see that decreasing. Those are hard dollars, right? These are all established business metrics that automation can play in, and you can measure the impact on. And where it really becomes important, as we just talked about all these new opportunities and new technologies coming out, we're not talking about hours saved anymore. We're talking about brand new tasks that were never done before. How do you measure that, right? So preparing your business to understand the impact of automation as it goes beyond RPA, beyond the task, is really, really important. Otherwise, you're not going to really understand the ROI of having an LP embedded into your business, or OCR or image recognition, or any of the more advanced things that are coming out from a front end space when you're talking about chatbots, right? And the impact of customer service that your automations may play in. All of these things, if you're really just looking at task hours saved, is going to be a problem because you can't measure them. So really, even when you're just in RPA, you're not to the more applied ML use cases yet. Really preparing the organizations to look for and measure those things, so that when you get there, you're ready. You don't have to figure it out for 3 years to figure out what your impact is, and you can measure the ROI kind of off the bat. I think it is very important, and it opening our eyes to the fact that it's not these are metrics that are dollars, not just kind of these theoretical things that we hope to achieve, is a really important conversation to have.
And I think that really what we're might be leading to here is this concept of really making sure that you understand straight through processing all the way through, not just your department, but end to end, how that business process is impacting your bottom line from all the way through. But not just understanding of that process, but what are your measurements at each step of those ways, and making sure that you have the benchmarks, you have the key metrics that are driving, right? So the one example that I love is customer experience or your customer engagement, and how important right now is customer engagement, right? When you have repeat buyers and you have people, it's like, you can trust them to continue to come back because they get world-class services from you, which means you're really impacting, them in a different way. So if you have automations that are positively impacting that, how do you measure that? Well, if you didn't do any pre-measurements, right, and if you don't have a full understanding of that, and now you have automations getting put in place, this is exactly the situation that people are finding themselves in. You're like, well, yeah, that's great, and I think it's happening, but I don't really know how I can take advantage of that, or I don't even know how I can quantify that. Well, if you did some really easy benchmarking in the beginning stages before your automation goes in place, you know exactly where you were before that automation got put in place. Now, what does it look like post-automation? My gosh, now look at the quality scores, or look at my the net scores, right? Like all of these things really start to change. So Leslie,
the other categories of like audit and compliance, right? How much you spent on audit and compliance, and being able to track that, or how are you able to scale, the cost of scaling, right? The difference in how much more volume you're able to transact. If you don't understand what your volume transaction was before, how do you understand what it is now and what the delta was, and how automation impacted that in terms of scalability? We've mentioned customer experience. There's also that empowering impact of what does it do to your associates, right? What is automation? How does automation enable your associates? How does it make it that it's helping your people do their job better, right? And being able to understand, even from the sense of, let's say, a sales team, right? If you have automations that allow your sales team more time on the phone with people, as opposed to typing things in their ERP, can you compare their, let's say, just leads generated pre-automation versus post-automation, right? If you don't measure the pre-automation and you just see it at the end of the year, oh, something went up, you can't necessarily apply that to automation because there could have been a dozen other factors. But if you focused it and say, and study it, then you can quantify the impact of automation because you've narrowed it down, you've eliminated the variables, you've set a time scale, all those kind of experimental things, and you can actually start to gain that knowledge within your business.
Yeah, and I think the good news is that the focus from most of the industry on building out capabilities such as digital worker analytics and process mining is all dovetailing towards this point, right? Where we are able to now, obviously we always had qualitative ways to look at processes. You could always do, I've seen firms do design thinking workshops and journey mapping, but now you have this other set of technology that is coming in, which in some cases uses AI, in some cases kind of just granularly maps the process steps and the exceptions and how people actually do work. And that feeds quantitatively into this factoring of kind of how do you look at a process? How do you understand where the opportunities are? And when you look at the process end to end, how much it means in terms of the actual value that you get out of it, rather than just the pieces that you look at individually. So I think that's encouraging, and we'll see how that evolves over the next year, but I'm pretty bullish about how this pans out.
Yeah, some technology providers in terms of automation are just embedding it into their tool, right? So it's becoming more and more democratized, where you don't need to have this huge contract to have your process mining, your per process, how much data you put into it. There's options, right? You can start. Obviously, you want to get to a point where you're probably monitoring lots and lots of processes in real time with a huge amount of data. But you can enter that space even just with an automation tool, which is really, really exciting because, again, that idea of democratizing some of this technology, it is becoming more and more accessible to more and more people.
And it's critical, right? Because if you think about the single biggest issue that people have with scale, once they've sorted the governance out and once they've established process, the standards and things like that in a typical RPA program, is how do you feed the pipeline? And my own research shows that the companies that have typically been successful at scaling over time have typically started with a process portfolio or a process pipeline of, between 12 to 18 months ahead of where they were at that point in time. But that requires that you systematically sit down and understand your processes across the board, holistically, using whatever you use, whatever kind of tools you use internally or externally. But then the fact is that you understand your processes, you're able to build this pipeline that consistently feeds into your ability to create more and more automations and ship automations, right? And you don't just stop after you've reached a certain point. You're not looking around for, asking around within your business for more processes. Hey, what should we automate? That's not the right way to do it. But as long as you have a good sense of the pipeline that you have and how you are systematically shipping, identifying new processes for new automation candidates, quantifying them, building a business case, then actually going and building the automation and shipping it, that's the path to scale, really.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important to have that prioritized to, again, going back to your business objectives, right? and not to bring visibility back to our current situation of COVID-19, but we're really seeing that now, right? And if you have a pipeline that's filled with a whole bunch of great stuff, but that pipeline isn't really impacting kind of the bottom line. And as maybe we shift and we go off script here a little bit, but we did have a question come in that I think is tied back to kind of our conversation that we're having right now. And it really is around COVID-19 and is it really compelling businesses to accelerate automation efforts? And Leslie, I know that we talked last week and you were talking about some recession research that you were actually in the middle of. And I think this is a great time to maybe bring that up and how that really can help companies through this tough time.
Absolutely. So I actually have a piece of research on the anvil right now, which really takes from this paper that was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, where they looked at the recessions of the 70s and the 80s and compared them net to the recessions of the 90s and the 2000s. And what they were trying to look at was really employment statistics, right? So they looked at what they call the half-life of employment recovery, which is from the point at which the recession kind of formally ends, how long does it take in months for employment to reach half of that which existed, of the levels which existed pre-recession? And the findings are really compelling because the 70s and the 80s, the recessions that created unemployment, for these recessions, the half-life is between 2 to 6 months. Whereas as you come closer to where we are today, when you look at the 90s and the 2000s, the half-life, the same number, which means the amount of time that jobs take to recover to half their pre-recession levels has increased from the 2 to 6 months to 17 to 23 months, which is fascinating because to me, and if you read the paper, what you'll understand is that a huge amount of this lag in kind of employment catching up is really because companies are shifting their investments away from human labor and more towards automation. And to me, this path is only going to accelerate because automation is getting better and more pervasive, and it's creating a broader footprint across the organization, and it's getting a lot more reliable as we go forward. So to me, it's almost a no-brainer that whatever COVID, this crisis ends up being, as we recover from it, there will be a significant flow of dollars from where they are today to greater automation and more strategic, more transformational automation across the board.
I think that it's really critical as we look at, it's almost an accelerator into what we've been talking about for the last, 5, 6, 7 years, is around how important automation can really transform your business in your tactical day-to-days. But now we're really faced up against what we're going through. It brings a bigger focus to automation, but I love, kind of what you're saying as we're saying, okay, well, that's great that we're all being forced into this, but what is the overall turn after we start recovering and the impacts of automation and how it works, which is fantastic. Again, off script here a little bit, but I love to do this as questions and answers are coming in here. But there's a really great question that came in, which goes back to the pipeline that you and I, or the three of us, were really talking about, which is what are some of the parameters that we should be looking at in creating a pipeline for automation? I don't know, does anybody have a thought on that? I have some, but Peter, I know that you had some deep insights into pipeline and automation and the criteria that we should use for building out your pipeline.
Yeah, I think you really want to our points earlier, right? You have your options of what's your high volume, high cost, which those are important factors, certainly, but really you want to, again, start with what end-to-end processes, especially, again, we were talking about business criticality, right? And success and sustainability today. What business processes exist are critical to your business, and kind of force rank it that way, and then start going through and finding your opportunities within those, right? The parameters of, obviously, with RPA, you want things that follow very defined paths. But then at some point you can map those out and find, what the tools allow you, especially now, is really a full scope of understanding where things follow the same pattern and then where things deviate, where time lag happens, and understanding these are opportunities now for your intelligent tools, and really kind of going at it that way, where you find that you're really starting at that business process, right? That's the main parameter of understanding what business processes are critical to your organization and what's going to enable your organization to have success. I think that's really as we were alluding to earlier, a primary parameter that you want to look at.
Yeah. I think that there's oh, go ahead, Leslie.
I was just going to say, it's important to kind of look at it also from the lens of how much is it going to cost you to change the process to fit the automation itself, right? And it's something that many times gets overlooked, because people tend to be over optimistic on, the fact that you have exceptions, you have people who've kind of grown with the process and who are close to the process, and they understand ways, there's a tribal knowledge that develops around how to solve for certain kinds of exceptions. And you may not always be able to capture that in your cut and dry, financial analysis of whether it makes sense to automate the process or not. But when you actually get into the weeds, you start to realize that there's so much more nuance to actually the way that the process has evolved over the years. And so changing that is a real cost. So I think while the straightforward business case of, so much value, so much cost is very straightforward, but at the same time, companies should also think about what does it take to actually change the process, and what's the cost that I will have to incur to realign my operating model, my workflow mix, my manpower, all of that around this new process that I'm trying to build, which runs in a certain kind of way.
Yeah.
I think
go ahead. Sorry, Scott.
No, go ahead, Peter.
The trust, right? The people that have manually been doing the process, how much do they trust the automation? Because if they don't trust it, they end up doing the work again, right? So now not only have you invested in the automation cost, you actually haven't saved costs on the labor because they're going back and doing work. So going through that entire exercise of making sure that your current associates, the people that are doing it, are actually going to trust the automation, and that your automation is trustworthy to the point of the cost of change. That's definitely something, that's a cost of change that is often overlooked, of what happens when our organization actually doesn't trust the automation itself. So just kind of another layer to what Leslie was saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that I think it's a question of maturity as an organization, a business maturity. And you asked, where do we start within our pipeline? And I would offer back, well, how mature is the overall organization and standard processes? Where's your maturity and how you feel strategically you're going to place automation within your organization? And is there a particular place where you're going to be targeting within your automation to start building out what your pipeline is? And do you already have the predefined metrics or the benchmarks or the understanding of how you're impacting the bottom line, right? If you're an FSO, do you know where your benchmarks are around some of the key metrics that you talked about? In manufacturing, do you have those key benchmarks that you have? Or in oil, or wherever you live, do you have those key individual things identified that says, here's how automation is going to play into it. Here's the strategy for how we're going to attack that. And this is where the pipeline comes in to say, okay, now we're going to start tackling, all of this great material. So, but I think we're getting really close here on time. So I'll go ahead and just kind of close this out. It was a really great dialogue and discussions. I want to thank you guys for jumping on the webinar. But just a couple of key items that I think resonated quite well is this transition from back office into the small tail of business process, and really having an understanding of how that is going to impact and keeping an eye on that. But then this transactional, the transformation, we call it applied ML, or we call it applied anything else. It's like, it's great if it's data science work, but it really starts with a full understanding of what the business problem is, how it's going to impact the bottom line, and then really targeting that into the automations. Is there any last words that you would like to share with our participants today, Peter, Leslie?
You want to go
first? I don't know.
Peter?
Leslie,
yeah, this is what we call ad hoc here. So, yeah. All right. Well, I think we're kind of at the 11:45. So just I guess I gave you kind of the summary. So the webinar has been recorded and will be made available to download, to listen later, or if you would like to share with somebody else. And the links that we talked about for the Agilify will also be provided, the automation airwaves, the case studies, and the white papers. So if you have any follow-up questions or would like to learn more, please don't hesitate to go out to agilifyautomation.com and they contact us. We'll be more than happy to further dialogue with you. So thank you very much, Leslie and Peter, for the call, and for everybody for listening today. Thank you.